After Jean-Claude Van Damme, who is the next? Nobody.
And him and Bruce Lee were like such a tango, you know?
24 years. Why? No next. Where the next? Nobody. Why no?
Jean-Claude Van Damme and Bolo Yeung are two martial arts legends with a history that goes way back. But recently, Bolo dropped a shocking revelation about Van Damme, and it is not what fans expected. We will get to Bolo's big revelation soon. But first, let's rewind to where it all began. The two legends. Jean-Claude Van Damme and Bolo Yeung are two names that every action movie fan knows. One is the high-kicking, smooth-talking star of Bloodsport and Kickboxer. The other is the muscle-bound, stone-faced villain who made Bruce Lee work for his victory in Enter the Dragon. These two didn't just fight on screen, they built a legacy. But who they were before the fame, who were they before their first meeting? First, let's start with the man people call the Muscles from Brussels. Yes, Jean-Claude Camille Francois van Varenberg. That's his full name. Born in Belgium in 1960, Jean-Claude was not always the confident action star we know today. He was actually a skinny kid who got picked on a lot. So what did he do? He found martial arts. At 10 years old, his father put him in karate classes, and that changed everything. He trained hard, so hard that by the time he was a teenager, he was already competing and winning championships. Not just karate, though. He also studied taekwondo, kickboxing, and even a little ballet. And before you laugh, ballet's tough. He once said it was the hardest thing he ever did, but it gave him that famous flexibility. You know, the perfect splits he does in every movie. By his early 20s, Jean-Claude had built himself into a legit martial artist. He was not just some guy who could throw fancy kicks. He had real skills, real fights, and real trophies. But the thing is, being a martial artist and becoming a movie star are two different things. So he left Belgium and moved to Hollywood with barely any money and a big dream. Now let's talk about Bolo Yeung. His real name is Yang Zi, born in Guangzhou, China in 1946. If Jean-Claude's story is about fighting to prove himself, Bolo's is about being naturally built for greatness. From a young age, Bolo had one thing that set him apart: his size. This man was built like a tank before he even started lifting weights. But Bolo was not just big, he was strong. He got into martial arts early, training in traditional Chinese kung fu. But what really made him stand out was bodybuilding. At 19, he won the Mr. Hong Kong bodybuilding competition, and he kept that title for 10 years. You don't mess with that kind of dedication. And let's not forget his big break. It was Enter the Dragon film in 1973. That movie was Bruce Lee's Hollywood debut, but Bolo Yeung stole every scene he was in. He played Bolo, the brutal enforcer of the tournament, and let's be honest, he looked terrifying. Muscles on top of muscles, zero emotion, and a fighting style that made him look like he could crush a man with one punch. So now we have two future legends. One was a European karate champion with Hollywood dreams, and the other was a martial artist bodybuilder who had already worked with Bruce Lee. But the question is, how did these two end up on the same screen? The first meeting. By the mid-1980s, Jean-Claude was still struggling in Hollywood. He was doing stunt work, taking small roles, and basically waiting for his big break. And then he saw a poster for a movie called Bloodsport. The problem was that he was not in it. Bloodsport was based on the probably exaggerated real-life story of Frank Dux, who was an underground fighter who claimed to have won a secret martial arts tournament. Whether or not that's true, one thing was clear: this movie needed someone who could fight, look good on camera, and sell the action. And that's where Jean-Claude came in. According to legend, Jean-Claude walked into a producer's office, showed off his high kicks, did his famous splits, and just like that, he got the role. It was his moment. But a martial arts movie is only as good as its villain. And for Bloodsport, they needed someone intimidating, someone powerful, someone who could make Van Damme look like the underdog. Here came Bolo Yeung. Bolo was already famous in Hong Kong, but Bloodsport introduced him to a whole new audience. His character, Chong Li, was a brutal, undefeated fighter who basically crushed every opponent he faced. And then Jean-Claude and Bolo met for the first time. It was the 1980s, and filming for Bloodsport was about to begin in Hong Kong. Jean-Claude was in his late 20s and was finally the lead in a major movie. He was excited. He was ready. He walked onto the set, looked around, and then he saw Bolo Yeung. And that's where things get interesting. Jean-Claude, despite all his training, was still new to movie fighting. Yes, he could do amazing kicks and had real fighting experience, but stage fights were different. Bolo, on the other hand, had been doing this for years. He knew how to move, how to sell a hit, and most importantly, how to make himself look unstoppable. And let's just say, Bolo was not exactly an easygoing guy on set. He took fighting seriously. If you weren't careful, you might actually get hit. And Jean-Claude noticed that right away. But what really made their first meeting special was mutual respect. Despite their different styles and backgrounds, they got along. Jean-Claude saw Bolo as a legend, someone he had watched on screen growing up. And Bolo saw potential in Jean-Claude, someone with real talent, real skill, and a real future in action movies. And just like that, an on-screen rivalry and an off-screen friendship began. Now, what was their off-screen bond like? What happened after they stopped filming for Bloodsport? Off-screen bond. So Bloodsport wrapped up filming, and by now, Jean-Claude Van Damme and Bolo Yeung had spent weeks working together. They had thrown punches, delivered dramatic stares, and created one of the most intense final fights in martial arts movie history. But what happened once the cameras stopped rolling? Did they just walk away and never speak again? No, not even close. Let's be honest, if you only knew them from Bloodsport, you would think they were bitter enemies. Well, it is not hard to believe. Chong Li literally crippled one of Van Damme's friends in the movie. The tension, the grudge, the pure hatred on Bolo's face, it felt real. But behind the scenes, it was a completely different story. From the start, Jean-Claude and Bolo respected each other. Jean-Claude admired Bolo's experience, his strength, and his reputation. Bolo, in turn, saw Jean-Claude as the new rising star of action movies, a young guy with both talent and charisma. It was not long before their working relationship turned into a real friendship. When they were not filming, they hung out on set. They would sit on apple boxes, drink tea between takes, and talk about martial arts, movies, and life. And this was not just for show. There were no cameras capturing these moments. It was just two martial artists bonding. And let's not forget, Bolo was already a veteran of the industry. He had worked with Bruce Lee, he had seen Hollywood come and go, and he knew how tough this business could be. Jean-Claude, on the other hand, was still learning. He was new to leading roles. He was still figuring out how to balance his skills with the demands of Hollywood. And Bolo became something of a mentor. But then Bloodsport wrapped and they went their separate ways. Now let's fast forward a bit. Bloodsport came out in 1988 and it became a hit. No one really expected it to blow up the way it did. But suddenly Jean-Claude Van Damme was a star. This movie was not just some low-budget action flick, it was a moment. It turned him into one of the most recognizable martial arts actors in the world. For Jean-Claude, this was the beginning of a whole new career. After Bloodsport, he went on to make Kickboxer in 1989, Lionheart 1990, and Death Warrant in the same year. He was rising fast and Hollywood wanted more of him. And what about Bolo? Well, despite Bloodsport's success, he didn't suddenly get a flood of Hollywood offers. At the time, he was still more famous in Hong Kong than in the US. He continued making action movies, but Hollywood did not know what to do with him. He was the perfect villain, big, strong, and intimidating. But for whatever reason, major American studios were not casting him in big productions. So while Jean-Claude was climbing Hollywood's ranks, Bolo was still mostly working in Hong Kong cinema, but that did not mean they had lost touch. By 1991, Jean-Claude had built a solid career for himself. He had done a mix of martial arts movies and mainstream action films, and he was looking for his next big project. That's when Double Impact happened. Now, Double Impact was not just another Van Damme movie, it was a Van Damme ×2 movie. He played twin brothers, one raised in Hong Kong, the other in California, separated at birth and reunited years later to take revenge. And guess who was cast as the main villain? Yes, Bolo Yeung. This was their big reunion. This time, the fight was not in an underground tournament. It was on the streets, in warehouses, and in high-stakes action sequences. And if you thought their fight in Bloodsport was brutal, Double Impact took it up a notch. But off-screen, nothing had changed. They still had that same dynamic. Jean-Claude, the energetic star on the rise, and Bolo, the calm, experienced fighter. They still spent time together between scenes, drinking tea, talking about the industry, and catching up like old friends. And here's something funny. Jean-Claude may have been the leading man, but when it came to on-set respect, Bolo was the legend. Even the stunt guys who had worked with some of the toughest martial artists in the world knew that Bolo was the real deal. If you got hit by him, you felt it. Now, the interesting thing is that after Double Impact, you would think Hollywood would have immediately paired them up again. But they didn't. And there are a few reasons for that. First, Jean-Claude's career was shifting. After Double Impact, he started moving away from pure martial arts films and into bigger, more mainstream action movies. Stuff like Universal Soldier in 1992 and Hard Target in 1993. These were still action-packed, but they were not necessarily the kind of movies that needed Bolo as the villain. Second, Bolo was still mostly working in Hong Kong. Even though Bloodsport and Double Impact made him famous worldwide, he was still more active in Asian cinema. He had a steady career there, and Hollywood was not giving him the same opportunities as Van Damme. But that didn't mean they stopped talking. Even though they were not working together as much, Jean-Claude and Bolo stayed in touch. Jean-Claude has often talked about how much he respected Bolo, not just as a fighter, but as a person. And Bolo has always had good things to say about Jean-Claude. They were not just co-stars, they were friends. There are old interviews where Bolo mentions how much he admired Jean-Claude's discipline. He saw him as someone who worked hard, trained every day, and genuinely cared about martial arts. He was not just some Hollywood guy pretending to fight, he actually knew what he was doing. And let's be real, Hollywood has plenty of actors who pretend to be fighters. Jean-Claude was not one of them. That's why he and Bolo got along so well. Even though they only made 2 major movies together, their rivalry became legendary. Fans still talk about their fights, still debate over who would win in a real fight, and still hope for one more movie where they face off. And honestly, even though both of them have aged, they could totally still do it. Imagine a modern-day Bloodsport sequel where an older Frank Dux or Van Damme is forced to fight in one last tournament only to find out that Chong Li or Bolo is still in the game. Fans would totally love that. But whether that ever happens or not, one thing is clear, that Jean-Claude Van Damme and Bolo Yeung created something special. On screen, they were enemies. But off-screen, they were 2 martial artists who respected each other, learned from each other, and formed a bond that lasted decades. This is a bond that everyone knows about, even Jean-Claude Van Damme's son, which is why he planned a secret reunion. So what happened? How did these 2 legends reunite? The recent reunion. Time has a funny way of bringing people back together. Jean-Claude Van Damme and Bolo Yeung had fought, trained, and built a legendary rivalry on screen. They had shared moments on film sets, bonded over martial arts, and remained connected despite not working together for years. But after decades of being apart, something special happened. It was an ordinary night in Los Angeles, except it wasn't. Jean-Claude's son, Chris Van Damme, had organized a special dinner at a Chinese restaurant. It was supposed to be a rare family gathering, a time for Jean-Claude to sit down with his loved ones and enjoy a meal without cameras, scripts, or Hollywood drama. But Chris had a surprise in store. A surprise named Bolo Yeung. Jean-Claude walked into the restaurant expecting a peaceful dinner, but his expression changed the moment he spotted Bolo sitting among the guests. At first there was confusion, a pause as he registered the familiar presence of his former on-screen nemesis. Then came recognition, followed by an immediate sense of excitement. It had been years since they had last seen each other, but the respect between them was still evident. The moment of reunion carried a weight that only those who had shared a history of hard work and discipline could understand. There had been countless hours spent together on set, intense training sessions, and shared experiences that only a select few could relate to. The handshake and brief embrace carried within them the acknowledgement of a bond that had never truly faded. As the evening unfolded, the 2 martial artists found themselves reminiscing about the past. The conversation drifted toward their early days, back when Bloodsport was still in production. They recalled the grueling shoot in Hong Kong, where the humidity made every fight sequence more exhausting than expected. There had been moments between takes when they would sit together on whatever makeshift seats were available, drinking tea and discussing techniques, philosophy, and the future of martial arts and cinema. They reflected on the way their careers had taken different turns after Bloodsport. While Jean-Claude had gone on to become one of Hollywood's biggest action stars, Bolo had remained a dominant figure in Hong Kong cinema. They had worked together again in Double Impact, but after that, their paths had diverged. Despite their mutual respect, they had not been brought together by the industry again. Now, sitting across from each other, they acknowledged how much time had passed. The evening was not just about the past, though. There was an ease in their interaction that came from years of experience and an understanding of what it meant to endure in the entertainment industry. Even without having worked together for years, their dynamic had not changed. Jean-Claude, full of energy, was expressive in his storytelling, while Bolo, ever composed, listened intently, responding in his quiet but impactful manner. At some point during the dinner, fortune cookies arrived at the table. Jean-Claude and Bolo, in the spirit of friendly competition, decided to play a quick game of rock, paper, scissors to see who would open their cookie first. If you have ever seen Jean-Claude play games, you would know he doesn't just play, he performs. He was fully into it, focusing like he was about to fight in another Bloodsport match. Rock, paper, scissors, and Bolo won. Jean-Claude opened the paper to read his fortune. A wish will be granted after a long delay. Then when it was time to read Bolo's message, he cunningly switched his with Jean-Claude's. Jean-Claude opened the piece of paper and froze. It was the same fortune. Everyone at the table started laughing. It was a fun evening after all. The presence of two martial arts legends in the same restaurant did not go unnoticed. Fans, recognizing them from across the room, began to approach, hesitant at first but unable to resist the opportunity to witness this rare reunion up close. Some shared personal stories of how Bloodsport had shaped their love for martial arts, while others recalled watching Double Impact as children. For many, this moment was more than just an encounter with celebrities. It was a meeting with two figures who had defined an era of action cinema. Photographs were taken, and appreciation was exchanged. Jean-Claude and Bolo acknowledged the fans with kindness, understanding the significance of their impact on generations of moviegoers. Their influence extended far beyond their film careers. They had inspired countless individuals to pursue martial arts, fitness, and the discipline that came with it. As the night went on, there was an understanding that this was more than just a casual dinner. But then Bolo made a strange revelation about Jean-Claude. So what did he say? The revelation. The night was going great. Laughs, memories, good food, and an unexpected reunion. But then Bolo Yeung decided to drop a little bombshell. And of course, it was about Jean-Claude. Somewhere between the last bites of dinner and the playful banter, Bolo casually mentioned something that made everyone stop for a second. He brought up Bloodsport, more specifically, how Jean-Claude had acted around him back then. Now to the world, Van Damme was the fearless, high-kicking action star who could take down anyone. But according to Bolo, things were a little different behind the scenes. Apparently back in those early days, Jean-Claude had been a little nervous around him. Not scared exactly, but let's just say he was extra careful. Bolo, already a famous martial artist and a guy who had worked with Bruce Lee, had that effect on people. He noticed Jean-Claude watching him closely, staying on his toes, and let's be real, probably making sure he didn't get accidentally crushed during fight rehearsals. Now, was Jean-Claude actually intimidated? He laughed when Bolo brought it up, but he didn't exactly deny it either. He just shrugged, grinned, and let the conversation roll. But then things took an interesting turn. Someone at the table brought up the idea of a sequel. A Double Impact follow-up had been rumored for years, and now here they were, sitting together again. If there was ever a moment to make it happen, this was it. The fortune cookie message from earlier suddenly felt like a sign. Was this it? Was Double Impact 2 finally going to happen? Bolo, as always, played it cool. He didn't give a straight answer. He just smirked, nodded slightly, and let the suspense build. Jean-Claude, on the other hand, looked like he was seriously considering it. Nothing was confirmed that night, but the idea was out there. And let's be honest, if these two ever teamed up again, the fans would lose their minds. So what do you think? Would you want to see Jean-Claude Van Damme and Bolo Yeung reunite for a double impact sequel? What kind of story would you like to see? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more legendary stories. We will come back soon with the next one.